Hello and welcome back to Chapter 1. Now we're going to be talking about some communication principles, some misconceptions regarding communication, as well as ways to communicate more competently. Communication principles will help better define what communication really is. Communication is always going to be transactional, meaning that there is mutual influence. What I do will affect people I am communicating with, and what other people do or say will affect me. Imagine communicating with your boyfriend or girlfriend that you are having a rough day. At that point, that is obviously going to end up influencing them in how they respond, in how they react to you. Also, there's interdependent behavior that, again, that I will depend on some people that I have relationships with in certain ways for support, for practical concerns, for things like that. And then their behavior will also I will also rely on as well. I will depend on. And then lastly, it is uniquely created, meaning that every relationship is going to be a little bit different. What is your relationship with your priest or your parents or your boyfriend or girlfriend or your sister or brother? All of which are going to have uniquely created components. So that is the first communication principle. It is also unintentional or intentional. Intentionality can change the meaning. If I were to, for example, spill a drink on someone unintentionally, that would obviously communicate something, and it might not be taken that badly. Versus if I were to intentionally do it, then of course that would be a challenge. Another good example of this is what happens if, for example, this happens. If it was intentional, then that would be very challenging. If it was unintentional, then that might be considered fine. Also irreversible. It is also irreversible, meaning that if I communicate something, I cannot change it. I can apologize for it, add further meaning onto it, but I cannot change that first meaning for someone else. I cannot take back that communication. Funny enough, though, in online communication, there is some ability to reverse what you've said, but but that is only when it has not been received by the other person. Also, it is unrepeatable. Have you ever experienced saying the same joke twice? A good example of this could be, are you ready? Two nuts are chasing each other. One turns to the other and says, I'm a cashew. Pretty great, right? So, now let's hear that again. Two nuts are chasing each other. One turns to the other and says, I'm a cashew. So, your first reaction to that joke is probably not the same as your second reaction to that joke. Also, it is the meaning has slightly changed because you already knew the punchline. So as a result, you're gaining a new meaning for that. So communication is unrepeatable. Uh, let's tie this away from jokes to how you solve an argument. If you solve an argument in one way, that's fine, but that same tactic may not work in other situations. Same thing for comforting someone, making someone like you. All of those things are unrepeatable. There's also a content and relational dimension to every message. A good example of this um, could be to say, um, hi, my name is James. How are you? The content of that message is polite greeting. And the relational message depends on how we know each other. First of all, if we have consistently met over and over and over again, then the relational message would be maybe that I'm pretending like I don't know you, and then that can have a very distinct message from what the content of my message was supposed to mean. We also have, but it could also mean other things as polite greeting or whatever. So now that we've discussed some of the principles of communication, let's move over to the characteristics of communication. So, first, the uniqueness. Again, interpersonal communication is always going to be unique. Uh, Talking with parents versus friends are going to affect what you are able to talk about or what you should talk about. Again, we also have interdependence. What that other people will affect us through their communication, as well as we will continue to depend on other people in our interpersonal interactions, be it for social support, be it for practical concerns, because we live in a social environment where we cannot be an island on our own. We also have self-disclosure. Self-disclosure is a fundamental part of interpersonal communication. It is showing who we are. While there's a lot of benefits, there can also be costs, things we'll discuss at a later time. But we tend not to like disclosing ourselves, but there is some variability there. Some people are more comfortable, some people are less comfortable self-disclosing. But it is a fundamental part by which we create social connection, so we have to learn how to improve that. And then we also have intrinsic rewards. What are some of the things we gain through our relationships? The physical needs of connection, the social needs of connection are two big intrinsic rewards associated with communication and interpersonal communication specifically. Now let's move on to some of the communication misconceptions. There are a few big communication misconceptions that can cause us great harm. First, not all communication seeks understanding. Not all communication seeks understanding. A lot of times we think of communication as something that I'm trying to better understand you and that it is about clarity of my message. That being said, some things do not seek understanding. What are some of the social rituals that we enact every day? Things like, maybe a handshake, maybe um, maybe brushing our teeth every day. Does that communicate something? No, that's just a social ritual. That's a ritual that we continue to engage in. Also, there are many attempts to influence others. Uh, that it is to that there are pushes to influence, not to communicate understanding. And that may happen through deliberate ambiguity or deception to abstract meaning, to make it harder for meaning to be understood, so that I will be able to influence you to my ends. Things like, hey, where are you going today, Steve? I'm going out. That is to diminish meaning so that Steve doesn't have to invite me to wherever he's going. Also, more communication is always better. That is a misconception as well, because how many work emails do you receive? If you have 50, would it be better to have 100? No, because more communication is not always better. So it's more about the quality of communication than the quantity. Sometimes. Obviously, it's not as black and white as that. What about when you are in an argument, when it has gotten to the point where it is very high levels of tension? Communication may not be better. At that point, it might be better to take a step back and not communicate and take a little second for tempers to cool. Also, communication will solve all problems. This is not true either, because there may be people who have very distinct environments, or maybe there is someone who is not acting in a way to try to create a positive benefit for both of us. So, for example, if I were to say, hey, you stole that from me, could you please give it back? And then the other person says, no, I'm not giving it back. I found it. At that point, there may not simply be a communicated solution simply because we both have very distinct ideas of what happened, as well as that my communication, uh, I mean, may only uh, increase tensions when it is not being listened to. So communication cannot solve every problem. There are some relational problems that cannot be solved. When someone cheats, can that be solved through communication? In some relationships it can, but in others it can't. And then the very last one is that effective communication is a natural ability, something that we are born with. But that is not true either. Communication, like any other skill, can be developed. So, this implies that we have untapped potential, that if we feel like we are bad at conflict, it is a skill like any other, therefore it can be developed. Maybe I'm not good at communicating social support. At that point, I can improve that skill. So, we should strive to continue to improve our abilities. An interesting part of this is that incompetent communicators can actually see themselves as quite skilled. A big reason for this is because of an inability to listen or unwillingness to listen. Because if you are not listening to other people, then you are not able to perceive feedback from others that would act as a check on your own perspective of yourself. That you may communicate a distasteful joke, or maybe even a bad joke. So, two nuts are chasing each other. One turns to the other and says, I'm a cashew. When I hear no laughing, an incompetent communicator could very easily say, well, they just don't understand jokes. And just like that, myself is preserved, but also I have diminished my skill at communicating. Now we move from some of the misconceptions of communication to how to communicate effectively. Competent communication involves effective and appropriate communication. So, effective in that I get what I set out to do. Have you ever um, wanted to have an effective conflict with someone, or maybe have someone like you in a certain way, and then it didn't work, but you kept on trying the same strategy with others? That speaks to effectiveness, that if we are not able to achieve our goals, then we may want to change our communication strategies. Also, appropriateness is important. This is reflected by context. What is appropriate can be affected by the situation, the relationship, as well as the cultural contexts. Keep in mind the cultural reflection right here of everything covered but her eyes would a cruel male dominated culture, whereas the person on the right says nothing covered but her eyes would a cruel male dominated culture. That both have the same meaning for for two completely different um, uh, things. Also, competent communication is a skill. Like any other, it can be learned. So there's no single ideal or effective way to communicate, that it does vary across culture. Keep in mind, this example, appropriateness would be the same for, would be fine for each of these people, but in different cultures, it would be perceived as very um, ineffective or inappropriate. So, This speaks to the uniqueness of our communication and what is appropriate and effective in different cultures. A good example of this is what were some of the things that we were able to talk about or that were not seen as on their face inappropriate like 20, 30 years ago. Just look at the TV show Friends. There's a great deal of things that are inappropriate when perceived through today's lens. So, some characteristics of competent communication is having a large repertoire of skills: empathy, conflict management, technological communication skills, uh, listening, humor. Those sorts of things are skills that can be can be used. That being said, communication is not just skills based. It is not just about developing skills. It is also about learning when to use those skills. We also have adaptability, adapting to certain situations and knowing when to adapt. Also, ability to perform skillfully in these situations, being involved in the communication situation. Imagine, if you will, a time that you are watching TV and someone else is trying to talk to you. Or, what's more applicable to today's age, where we are all talking together and I am on my phone. Involvement can be a big benefit, and when it's not there, be a great detriment to relationship building. We also have empathy and perspective taking the perspective of another person instead of just saying, I'm sorry. Cognitive complexity, being able to um, adapt to multiple different situations. And we have great cognitive complexity naturally. This is reflected by the hypothetical example of, let's say you and your friend are talking at work. Or sorry, you and your friend are not on the clock yet, but you are talking in the break room. Now, you both clock in and you continue talking. Has the context changed? Is what is appropriate changed? Then let's say your boss walks in. Then you're able to talk, but the context has changed again. Then your boss leaves, and Steve, the person who no one really gets along with, comes in and then starts talking about their weekend. That the situation has changed again, and then you both go out onto the floor, wherever, to start actually doing the job. You're still working together, but the situation has changed again, so that what you are able to talk about has changed again. So there are a lot of cognitive complexity inherent in the human experience because we have to adapt and know multiple different ways that things can go and should go in accordance with the situation, relationship, and culture. We also have self-monitoring. Monitoring ourselves and how we affect others, that is incredibly important. But we should strive to be like Goldilocks, not too high self-monitoring, not too low self-monitoring. But this is to make sure that we are conforming to the expectations of a situation, relationship, or culture. There is a big part of this as well, and that is the advent of social media. There are some big characteristics that have to be addressed with social media: leanness, synchronicity, as well as permanence. Leanness or richness of a social media channel affects the message. The lean communication has lack of nonverbal communication and high levels of hyper personal, and can even have hyper personal communication. So, let's, for an example, text-based social media apps like Twitter, like Facebook. Those have very low ability for the other person to respond through nonverbal feedback, as well as not a lot of the nonverbal is communicated in this situation. That is a very lean channel. Another a more rich channel may be Zoom. that is a social media channel where there is more nonverbal and therefore more ability for nonverbal feedback. In the lean channels of social media, there is something called hyperpersonal communication, where we can communicate more personal information than we would feel comfortable doing in a face-to-face or less or more rich social media environment. We also have asynchronistic versus synchronistic. This is a time gap between the message being sent and received. A good example of this is maybe a text would be more asynchronistic, meaning that when I send the message, maybe it would take a while for you to receive it. Email is highly asynchronistic. Video may be highly asynchronistic. Versus a Zoom meeting would be highly synchronistic, and that there would be that there would be high synchronicity, meaning that as soon as I send a message, you have received it. Then there is permanence, whether or not it is stored indefinitely or not. Snapchat is one of the exceptions that it actually is not very permanent, that things are not stored indefinitely. And it also highlights the benefit or the situation here that leanness, synchronicity, and permanence, more is not always better. That there are times where lean communication is better than rich communication, or synchronous, or maybe even asynchronous, is better than synchronous, or that things being permanent may be better than something not being permanent. So there's many different facets to social media. So with social media, it affects in relational quality. It increases the amount and quality of interpersonal communication. The big reasons why are because it is easier and less complicated. I can send a text a lot easier and a lot more simply than to physically talk to someone about it. It can also be incredibly rich and satisfying, but only when we have developed this skill. And when communicating competently with social media, be considerate. Biggest model. Because it respect from others, respect to others by showing undivided attention. Keep your tone civil, because with disinhibition, this feeling that due to the social media characteristics of leanness, especially, as well as asynchronicity, that I am less inhibited to share myself. I can engage in more hyper-personal communication. But this can also cause a lot of cyberbullying. Look onto any thread on social media about a certain political figure, and you will see a lot of this disinhibition at work, creating an uncivil tone, which can actually be a great detriment to any side. Also, being mindful of bystanders. What you communicate to just one person it may be sent out to a lot of people. So if you comment on someone's post, other people will see it as well. And also balance mediated and face-to-face time as well. That we should not just communicate through social media. We also have to have some face-to-face time. This is a challenge, especially in a pandemic. That being said, there are means of using social media channels that are very much like face-to-face, Zoom, for example. In general, we should strive to embrace modality, meaning that there are multiple modes of communication, because each one has their own distinct benefits and detriments. Zoom is good for a lot of things, but I have had multiple family meetings where people just start talking over each other. And I don't have any ability or even willingness to share my perspective, share what I think about something, just simply because people are talking over each other. But that may be reduced through a text chain, for example. And be careful what you post, because what you post can be very permanent and will stay there forever. With that, have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you next time.